Good afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Paul Miller, the just recently elected chairman of the Ulster Society of Chartered Accountants. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the first in a series of webinars with British Business Bank. The feedback from our members on the previous webinars has been great, and we're keen to continue those on topics that are of interest. Today, we're very thankful to welcome the British Business Bank along to conduct today's webinar. So we have Julia Groves with us, who will be taking the seminar today, who's the Managing Director of Sustainability, and also Susan McCain, who effectively looks after the network in Northern Ireland. For anyone who wants to catch up on any of our previous webinars, feel free to look on our website, which is charteredaccountants.ie/Ulster. So in today's webinar, Julia is going to cover the issue of sustainability and the responsibilities upon businesses and their advisors in meeting sustainability targets. The presentation will cover the basics of net zero and carbon accounting, the broader consideration of environmental, social and governance factors in business decisions, reporting, risk management and finance, and I suppose the role of FDs, financial controllers and advisors in assisting their clients. So a little bit of background just about Julia. Julia's been working on building a more sustainable economy for more than 20 years. This has included funding renewable energy generation, making finance more democratic, and creating sustainable investments. More recently, she was a partner and executive committee member at the private equity firm Downing LLP, where she led their transition to becoming a responsible investor. Prior to this, Julia has been the founding chair of the UK Crowdfunding Association, a founder and director of a number of startups, and she remains an active angel investor in early stage sustainable businesses. So Julia certainly knows her stuff, is very passionate about the topic, and I'm sure it's going to make for a great webinar as we go into that. Feel free on the way through to put any questions in the Q&A box, and they'll either be covered on the way through the presentation or at the end. But first of all, before we come on to Julia's presentation, I'm going to hand you over to Susan McCain, who's going to give a bit more background and intro just to the British Business Bank. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm absolutely delighted to have an opportunity to welcome everyone today to what I know will be a hugely enlightening session, focusing in, as Paul says, on net zero and ESG and lifting the lid on why SMEs should take action, what they can do and how the British Business Bank is involved. In terms of agenda, just in advance of handing over to Julia, being relatively new to the team, I just wanted to take the opportunity to introduce myself, having joined the bank as Senior Network Manager here in Northern Ireland just before Christmas and after more than 20 years in Danske Bank. You'll of course all know Susan Nightingale very well, but just for anyone who isn't familiar with the bank, if I can just take a few moments to explain who we are and what we do. So BBB was established in 2014 as the UK government's economic development bank, and we're not a bank in the usual sense. We don't lend or invest directly to businesses. Instead, we work alongside delivery partners who do this on our behalf, and because they work with us, then they can lend and invest more. In terms of the overarching mission, it's to drive sustainable growth and prosperity across the UK and to enable the transition to a net zero economy by improving access to finance for smaller businesses. So the mission is underpinned by our 4 strategic pillars. So the first being driving sustainable growth, and that's ensuring smaller businesses can access the right type of finance they need to start, survive and grow. So we work not only to increase the supply of finance for smaller businesses, but also to create a more diverse finance market, offering a greater choice of finance options and providers. Then under unlocking potential, we're ensuring entrepreneurs can access the finance that they need regardless of where and who they are. And so by addressing regional imbalances, it means that whether they're based in Belfast or up in the Northwest or across in Manchester, say, we want entrepreneurs to have the same level of knowledge and opportunity when it comes to accessing finance to grow their business. And on that point, I'll just take the opportunity here to plug our upcoming Access to Finance conference in partnership with InvestNI and Intertrade Ireland, which is happening on the 20th of June in the Guildhall. So we'd be absolutely delighted to see you and your clients there. In moving on to backing innovation, we want to ensure innovative businesses can access the right capital to start and scale. And then finally, the hot topic of today, building the modern green economy by helping SMEs transition to net zero so that they thrive in a green future. In terms of impact on the ground, as mentioned, the bank works with over 200 delivery partners like White Rock, Enterprise NI or Clarendon locally. And in doing so, we've supported over 96,000 businesses and £12 billion of finance across the UK. So whether the businesses are at startup stage, looking to scale up or stay ahead, we have a vast range of programmes, initiatives and funds to support those journeys. And on top of the funding already in place, later this year, we'll also see a further £70 million introduced to NI on both the debt and equity side through our regional funds. We also have our online finance hub, which is a really great source of information for businesses with lots of helpful guides on various topics, including ESG and net zero. So now that just leaves me to pass across to Julia, our Managing Director of Sustainability. As Paul had alluded to, with over 10 years experience in tackling sustainability and finance, she really has an incredible wealth of knowledge and expertise, and so it's wonderful to have her lead today's session. Thank you.
What an introduction. How fantastic. Hello, everyone from sunny London. I hope you can hear me okay. You'll be able to work out that I'm from where you're from. And, you know, the bank is genuinely committed to whole of UK access to finance. And I was really pleased when I got here to find so many people with similar accents wandering around the building. It isn't always the case when you're based in London. So any opportunity, Susan, as you know, for me to get over or talk to people locally, I'm very happy to do. I've really enjoyed working with Susan A for a period of time, and now Susan 1, I guess we'll call you. It's just fantastic, and it's really good to be connected. So I really want to try and make sure this is a useful session. Those of you who do presentations a lot will know that you're just talking to a screen, so I've no idea who's there or whether everybody's disappeared. Please do fire in questions at any point. If it's boring, say boring. If it's too technical, say too technical. Paul will stop me in my tracks. It wouldn't be the first time he's done that. And make sure this is useful, because I totally respect your time. But as Susan said, the idea is to give you a bit of a quick overview of the drivers for sort of net zero and the challenges, I guess, for SMEs, and also some of the opportunities which are there as well. As she said, I mean, I'm clearly not a public sector person. I'm clearly not a bank person. I've been funding and building very small businesses over a long period of time. I've done 6 startups from naught to exit. And so I'm very passionate about making sure that smaller businesses in different areas have got the access to finance that they need. So without further ado, let me move on down. I'm going to start with what we mean by sustainability, because that can mean different things in different places. You know, and this is the most generic definition of it, which is basically meeting our own needs without compromising the ability of future generations. So for the purpose of these conversations, people say ESG, they say sustainability, they say net zero. It's jargon-tastic, this whole area. Sustainability for us incorporates not just the environmental, but social, and I'll talk you through that. So, you know, you got to do things sustainably, not just in terms of energy and environment, but also social and economic resources. And in particular, for those of you who work in financial institutions, obviously trust and reputation are important. You know, if you do things in a non-sustainable way, if you're speculative, if you take risks, if you let people down, the next time you go knocking on the door, they're not going to be there. So it's a generic principle for us, as you saw in the mission, driving sustainable growth. And I guess what's also really key for us is to not separate the environmental from the social. So the remit of the bank was very much around net zero. But because we are a social investment bank, because levelling up has always been a massive, massive part of the agenda, we have to do a combination of environmental and social at the same time. And I guess the easiest terminology for that would be just transition, if that's a phrase you've heard. There is an opportunity here for lots of innovation, lots of investment, more efficient, more profitable ways of doing things, but also to maybe slightly rejig the balance in terms of where the funding is going and where the opportunity is from that perspective. So just transition, very much something that we are focused on. And also this kind of concept of ESG versus impact. So for us, when we talk about ESG, we're talking about environmental, social and governance factors. And it doesn't matter what industry you're in or what you're trying to achieve. This is not about morals. This is not about values. It's not about impact. It's about understanding that the rules of the game are changing slightly. And when we or anybody else is investing in a business, they should be thinking about whether that business is still viable and profitable and sustainable in a number of years' time. And hopefully we'll get to the conversations here about carbon tax and carbon pricing, and at what point we think this is really going to bite, in terms of there's going to be a very clear bottom line impact of your emissions and your climate position from that point of view. But here, when we're talking about ESG, we're talking about making sure that when we choose a delivery partner, or in the areas where we occasionally do direct investments, is that business model viable. So what would be an example? Lots of cities in the UK now have ultra low emission zones. Frankly, that is driven as much by pollution as climate change. We've got lots of areas in the UK where we are exceeding the safe limits, and there's a clearly proven scientific link between high pollution areas and health issues. So more and more of these ultra low efficient zones are coming into place, and that's a government policy or mayoral intervention. If you are running a fleet of vehicles and you've got diesel vehicles, as soon as that ULEZ comes in, it costs you more to drive your delivery truck into that particular area. So without believing in climate change, or even if you didn't care about pollution, there's just a straight coin issue there, which may change the economics where you go, right, well, if I'm the one with the fleet of diesels not able to go in or pay whenever I go in, and your man has a fleet of electric vehicles he's invested in and he doesn't, then his operating costs have just got lower. So these factors might be another example we talk about a lot, is one of our businesses, which is Deliveroo. And Deliveroo is just primarily a large number of people on two wheels delivering food. And so at the minute, those individuals are not the employee of Deliveroo. Therefore, the company doesn't pay their national insurance, doesn't pay their pension, etc. And very crudely, I'll get all my numbers wrong, guaranteed, you would add 20% on, wouldn't you, in terms of the cost of those people if they became employees. And so in a situation where the government might go, well, why am I taking care of their pension and their NI? Shouldn't the company be doing that? That's an example of something we call an externality, where something where the business goes about doing its normal day-to-day stuff. It has inputs, processes and outputs. But as a result of doing their business and making their profit, there are externalities. I guess a last one might be some of the water companies, which are now obviously privatized. And for years, they generate revenues, they have profit, the profit is paid out to the shareholders. Maybe they should have kept a little chunk of that money in their back pockets and reinvested it in the pipelines. But with having not done that, they're in a position where, as we get more and more extreme weather events and flooding, the water levels rise and the same infrastructure is used to deal with the sewage as they used to deal with the overflowing water. And before you know it, you have sewage and waterway. So these are all things which, yes, look, I mean, that's a reputational risk. You could say that's a moral consideration, but the principle of externalities is we're expecting companies to have to take more and more responsibility for things which are currently not on their balance sheet, not hitting their P&L, which might in the future. So that's what we mean by ESG, which we'll talk about a lot about today. In terms of impact, we're then talking about where we make investments and we think it has a wider social benefit. So that £70 million fund for Northern Ireland. Of course, we want to find brilliant entrepreneurs in business working through all our delivery partners. But the reason why we want to do that is we believe there are great business opportunities and SMEs in Northern Ireland that will grow and create jobs and pay taxes. And so the impact we're looking for is trying to make sure that we don't have entrepreneurs in different communities, different characteristics, parts of the UK, I don't know, west of the Bann, unemployment levels. How do we get the money to flow to those areas? Not for the goodness of our heart, but because there are opportunities there and for business and for productivity and for growth. And that's part of the impact that we look at. So these are just some of the definitions I wanted to kind of get out of the way as we're having the conversations. So here's some examples of the wider ESG factors, which I'll take you through before we narrow down into climate. So yes, climate change is a big deal. Water use, supply chains, pollution we've talked about. Very hot topic at the minute, nature and biodiversity, and a massive opportunity for Northern Ireland, I think, particularly in the agricultural sector. You know, a lot of smaller farmers there in supply chains for big supermarkets who I think are going to come under pressure quite quickly to look at their emissions, because if Tesco and Sainsbury's say they're going net zero, you better believe the SMEs that supply them are as well. But new revenue streams there, and lots of innovation and support around nature and biodiversity, and how, you know, a farmer or a landowner or a business could monetize that and make sure they're getting some kind of income for what they're doing. Social, yes, look, levelling up is really big. Just thinking about the natures of the contracts, you know, is it, I don't know, is it right that the delivery drivers are employees or not? How do we feel about 0 hours contracts? Is that quality employment? Is that what we want to do? All the way through to things like data protection and privacy, as you would expect. And then governance, you know, absolutely vital, but we are in the UK. Many of us are in regulated entities or industries, so the governance standards tend to be higher, but new challenges coming in there on things like cybersecurity and push for sort of board diversity, etc., to get good decisions made. So these are the number of things that we look at. So I'm going to just briefly talk about the net zero side of things, because it's not really the purpose of this session to persuade you all about climate change, but you watch the news and you read the papers, but in general, more and more consistent view worldwide that we are seeing greenhouse gases emissions still growing, unfortunately. We know the impact that has on the environment, and we look at then the physical and transition risks of moving to a world where we can live and work and play and do business in a slightly different economy than we're experiencing today. So, you know, the idea is that we're still, you know, we're on 1.2 already. We ideally would like to live at 1.5. Somewhere between 1.5 and 2.0, and we'll talk about some of the frameworks that say what the different repercussions are for different areas if we don't manage to get a handle on this fairly quickly. The key number, which you've probably heard a lot about, is net zero by 2050. And there's 2 reasons why I think that's a very dangerous number. Firstly, because Paul might be around, but I will definitely be off-ski by that point with these stress levels. 2050 is the year which we have got to get to, assuming that we cap it out by 2030 and we start to drop. So the shape of the curve changes quite a lot. If we don't hit the peak very, very soon, the longer we carry on going up, the more rapidly we have to come down. So 2050 is the result of where we need to get to. But what's most important is what we achieve over the next 7 or 6 years. It also just sounds like it's too far away. So I think there's a lot of people, frankly, in quite senior positions who think, well, I can just, you know, kick the can down the road from that point of view. So a lot of what we'll talk about today is why we would suggest that you should be engaging with clients and helping them to not kick the can down the road, because there are various interventions which are going to create a brick wall in a 2 to 3 year time frame. And hopefully there's a really important role you guys can play in getting the companies ready for that and making sure they're in the strongest possible position when it gets there. Are we on track? This is probably just a wee bit OTT, but nearly all of the countries around the world, all the significant ones, have got nationally determined contributions. So they all have plans for how they're going to get there. And these are audited more and more to say, first of all, do all these plans add up to less than 2%? And then secondly, do the policies align with the commitments that each country has made? And then thirdly, are you actually doing what you said you would do? And so you can see on the left-hand side what this kind of looks like. 1.8 is the really optimistic scenario, assuming we deliver everything that we've announced. The pledges and targets get us to 2. Based on 2030 only, that's 2.4, and then real world action gets you to 2.7. 2.7 is pretty disastrous in terms of the weather events and the various knock-on changes from that, which we'll cover in a little bit more detail later. But so lots of commitments globally made. It's not just the UK. And what I'm going to give you a bit more detail on is the various policies and regulations beneath that that suggest it's going to get done. But that's enough for now. I thought we might have a quick poll question to see what you think. So this is based on a YouGov study in 2021. So bear in mind it is 2 years ago now. What percentage of UK citizens do you think believe that climate change is man-made? Can everyone see that okay? Good. Interesting. Cool. So it's actually 72% as of a couple of years ago. And it's a different score in America. Let's just say that and leave it at that and move on. So here's the bottom line. You can see the typo already. So the point today is not to try and persuade you about climate change and whether it is real or we can do anything about it or me made it, we made it, or anything else. The point is that if the consensus is that it is man-made, the governments believe it, business believes it, the money believes it, it is driving quite a significant change in the economy over a period of time. And therefore, all businesses need to understand and start grappling with what it means for them, how it's going to affect them. So you could think it's all rubbish, but if this is affecting the cost of finance and your risk management and your regulation and your consumer attitudes and your supply chain and everything else, then it's something that's sort of hard to ignore. So I don't know if we wanted to, are there any quick questions at that stage, Paul? Anything that anybody wanted to ask before I start getting into some of those drivers for businesses and the regulations that are coming through?
Can I maybe just kick off with one there, Julia? The cost of finance. Do you think that there's a move in terms of funders, whether it be debt, equity, or whatever, really starting to price this in now in terms of their consideration as to either to give you a loan, not to give you a loan, whether to invest or not invest? So you think that has reached, the funders at this point?
So I would say it's hit the banks. And the reason why it's hit the banks is that the PRA brought in their expectations in 2019 was their regulation. And then they followed up in 2020. And it said in a Dear CEO letter, we expect climate risk to be fully priced in and managed by 2021. So it is horses for courses. If you are, for example, I guess the easiest idea is property, right? If you are lending against property, so it's a hard asset, and really the basis of your deciding whether or not to lend the money is on an L to GDV or on a probability of default or a loss given default or any of those kind of sort of typical lending terms. Because we can see, it's a perfect lead into the next slide, thank you, Paul, because we can see how quickly the regulation is coming into place, there is a chance that some of those assets that you're valuing now are not going to be worth in 5 years' time what they're worth today. So EPCs are a classic example from that point of view, or however you want to look at the energy efficiency rating of a building. RICS, so the guys who do the chartered surveyors valuation of property are just working through their climate risk stuff at the moment. But in reality, if you have a building which is below E in an EPC rating, then that becomes unrentable, and that's moving from E to D to C to B over a 5-year period, which means that if you are there with a portfolio of property, commercial or residential, you've got to look at it and go, right, for me to be able to rent that, I'm going to have to retrofit various things to improve the energy efficiency. So I guess the softest level would be energy prices are quite high. If you've got two identical properties side by side, the one with lower energy bills might be easier to rent, or you might get a higher rent paid for it. That would be like your softer. Your harder then is the mortgages and the change of the mortgages, where they're saying, genuinely, we think that during the period of this mortgage, you're going to have to put these measures in place because they're going to be regulations, and that either means you're going to have to borrow more money to do it, or we have to reduce the value of the property until you've done it, and both of those affect the loan to value. So if you're a lender in that situation, particularly if you've got a classic portfolio where all the loan to values are between 65 and 70%, that just pushes things outside your threshold. So I do think we'll quite quickly get to the point in things like, tangible hard assets, where it will actually affect the cost of capital because you'll move yourself into a different band in terms of the asset value. But also it is about thinking about residual values of technology. So if you are somebody who owns a fleet of diesel trucks and you're going to have to pivot to electric vehicles at some point, you really want to plan that ahead and do it gradually, because again, people will be less keen if you're leasing them out. They won't want to lease them, because if they lease them out, then they're going to have emissions. They're going to have to declare those emissions. That might be detrimental to their interest in terms of staying in supply chains. So I think that's absolutely where it's going. Is it there now? I don't really think it is, apart from in full PRA regulated banks. I think it's a question of preparing for that coming. So maybe I'll just kind of go on now and explain that kind of landscape. Oops. So you really probably don't want to get into all of this in detail. I'm more than happy to share the slides, but we mentioned there in 2019, the Bank of England supervisory statement, which said these things had to be embedded. Then that was followed up by the PARI Dear CEO letter. And we've already got things called so TCFD is the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures, and I'll come on and explain that a bit later. But this was set up by the Financial Stability Board. Apologies if you all know this, but the FSB is saying we think we're going to have 2008 all over again, and it's not going to be subprime mortgages, it's going to be stranded assets because of climate. So there are still entities, not many left now, sitting with coal mines on their balance sheet. And they've worked out that what the coal mine is worth on the basis of, this is how much I can sell coal for. This is how much it costs me to get out of the ground. Computer says, I'm going to put the assets in at that value. But what the policy and regulatory changes look like is, first of all, people are switching off coal all over the place and switching to alternatives. And I won't be disingenuous and say we haven't had a little wrinkle in the last few weeks, in the last few years, given COVID and people being very worried about energy security and thinking, gosh, what is our dependency on these countries, and are we getting gas from Russia, and what do we do about that? But the overall direction of travel is away from coal, because it is by far the worst offender in terms of the way that we heat and the way that we create power. So there's a potential reduction in demand. There's a potential that if you were to try to continue to use coal, the only way you'd be allowed to do that would be to create ways of removing the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere at the same time. So that's called carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon capture and storage, which is a cost you didn't have before. So all it takes is, when you're looking at that asset in very basic terms, if there's less demand and it might be worth less, I'm not even talking about it being banned, let's just say there's less demand and it's worth less because people have switched for various reasons to other forms of energy and power, and you get taxed on it, or you have to pay for the capture of the greenhouse gases, which nobody can really do properly yet and is very expensive, that changes the value of that asset. And that was the original definition of a stranded asset. So the Financial Stability Board thinks there's going to be another market impact like 2008. How do we avoid that happening? We're going to start now forcing companies to publish what their exposures are to these assets, how they manage them, what the governance is, what the risk management is, what the metrics and targets are, and we'll talk about that a bit later. At this stage, that is only applying to the banks, large asset managers, pension funds, LPs, etc. But it will in due course come down to the smaller players. And of course, in Europe, they've gone far ahead. And sitting in Northern Ireland, I'm guessing a lot of people there are exposed to both regimes. What a joyous position to be in, double regulated, got to be happy days. They've gone way further ahead. In EU, you've already got their SFDR, they're moving it from the super big companies to the smaller companies. And even in the UK in June, as well as in Europe, we've got this new International Sustainability Standards Board, which we will review and then adopt in due course. It's very complex. It will get simpler, but the the direction of travel is way more expectation on transparency and disclosure, because they think that's the way to manage the risk and ensure that investors understand where their exposures are. And as you do more transparency and you do more disclosures, this is what the investors expect. And so you'll find that lots of pension companies and IPOs and all the big guys and girls won't touch it unless they know that you've got these things covered. Now, from our point of view, completely different perspective, because we are not a private funder who's here to try and clean our portfolio. I mean, I can get to net zero in 2 years by ditching anything that isn't green and shiny. Green and shiny is a very, very small percentage of the economy from that point of view. So we do not exclude any sectors. We do not shy away from any areas, but what we will increasingly do with delivery partners is be looking at how do you know that you know what the exposures are in the portfolio? How are you working with those companies? Do they have a transition plan? Can we make this orderly and do it over a period of time? Can we please not wait and do nothing until it's 2029? Because what will happen is there'll be a sudden raft of measures. If we're not on track, they'll just turn up the heat and turn up the heat and turn up the heat. So really, I guess the message is to try and encourage companies to start as soon as possible, get there, get the early advantage, and we'll talk a lot more about how it is. So I'll just quickly go on to, these are some of the things you may be aware. So we've talked about energy efficiency standards, because obviously homes and transport and buildings, two really big areas. The government is going to publish the investment transition pathways, because the route is very different according to what sector you're in. Hairdressers and farmers, completely different scenario. The EU border mechanism, we love border mechanisms, comes in October 2023, and that is to prevent something called carbon leakage. I want to give you some jargon for the weekend. Try and see if you can mention carbon leakage in the pub. So carbon leakage is where individual countries or EU entities say, right, we're having no more coal, that is done. And so a company goes, oh, that's fine, I'll just go and do my coal work over here. And then I'm outside their regulations. And so this is going into place in October, first reporting in January. If you bring something into the EU that has used coal, fossil fuels, and has those emissions, you will pay a carbon tax on the way in. So that may not be relevant to everyone, but it's just an example of something quite close to home which could impact. Carbon tax is already in California and Canada and other areas. And carbon tax and carbon pricing, it's the same thing. It's basically the idea that at some point in time, in different jurisdictions, who knows where and who knows when, you'll end up having to pay for those emissions. It's a very, very blunt instrument, and it's one that we want to avoid for as long, I feel personally, as we can, because not everyone is in a position to suddenly just switch things out. It totally depends where you are, what technology exists, what transport options are in place. So we're fighting really, really hard on this just transition debate to say we are there to fund companies long-term through the transition. And if there's a lack of innovation, then that's where we should be putting our equity, is going in and funding these guys who are creating green steel and green cement, etc. That's what we need to fund. And hang in there with companies over the course of time, provided they understand where they're going. So I don't know if and when a carbon tax will be in place. What's quite common practice for the bigger companies and some of the more sophisticated risk managers and some of the more advanced delivery partners and lenders is something called a shadow carbon price, where when they're doing a business case for a new investment, they go, okay, what if there was a carbon tax? What would that do to this business case? And again, I think property is probably one of the areas this will bite first, because so many businesses have exposure to property and going, right, well, do I really want to go and build this new or buy this new, or, pick up that piece of plant and machinery, or where am I exposed to areas where I am using a huge amount of energy and a huge amount of heat, which is coming through a fossil fuel, and what do I do about that? So long term, it says horizon scanning. Nobody absolutely flip out yet. But the point is, from the standards and the regulations and the definition of net zero, we already know that in 2030, actually not 2035, 2030, there's no petrol or diesel cars to be sold, and 2035 is no more gas boilers. So The stress, which you all be aware of, is this tension between more and more regulations, the genuine need for this urgency, and small businesses who've just got through, have they got through Brexit and COVID and Ukraine and all the rest of it. And that's why I'm so passionate about this, is the role of the British Business Bank, and all our money and all our talent, energy and resource is about supporting those smaller businesses. And how do we sit in Westminster and translate these big changes in regulations and processes into something which is doable and understandable? And that's why we wanted to kick off this conversation today with you guys. Not that I have all the answers.
Hi, Julia. Would you mind if we, there's a couple of questions in here, one observation and a couple of questions. Maybe it would be useful to pick these up at this point before going on.
Yes.
So, just one is a very good observation. So, Joanna McCardle from Barclays Bank has said that they've just closed off a green term loan in the social housing sector this year. It's the first for the sector, fully ESG linked, and these covenants sit alongside their own financial covenants. There's an ESG pricing discount applied. If the client fails to meet those covenants, it reverts back to a brown term loan, i.e. the pricing discount gets removed. So, I mean, there's a live example of a bank effectively pricing, you know, in this area.
Perfect. Well done. More of the above, please.
And then a couple of questions, a short one, and maybe one that will take a little longer for you to answer, but the short one, just in terms, you mentioned energy ratings there for properties. The question is that for NI or just GB?
It isn't particularly fit for purpose for either. So EPCs are just one of the ways. I think if we just, maybe I should use the term minimum energy efficiency standards, right? However those are done. But the idea is that, you know, the absolute limit is a 15% reduction in overall energy consumption across the UK. And that is primarily buildings, but also plant and machinery. And so that group of people, that is led by Dame Alison Rose, I think RBS NatWest. It's managed by McKinsey. It's an incredible, I mean, all the Barclays, absolutely, a lot of the guys are involved in there about how do we do that. And you know, I guess that's as much driven by just getting your costs under control as anything else. So look, in fact, EPC isn't particularly working either. And so, but the idea is there will be minimum energy efficiency standards for buildings. I don't know whether EPC will survive over here, and I don't know what the best equivalent would be. So I should probably just say energy efficiency standards rather than EPCs in particular.
Okay, thanks for that. And then just that was from Aileen McShane, and just a question from Niall Rice. What specifically can the BBB and similar organisations do to make the commercial environment in NI more open to sustainable investment? Are there opportunities for political lobbying and influencing policy to make investment for SMEs easier?
So the good news is that the new, and so Susan McCain, you just must literally mute me if I say anything that I'm not like to say. Can you do that? But the 70 million pot, so I have rewritten the rules for that RFP. And in fact, actually, Paul, I had a conversation with you about that some months ago, just to get your view on whether how that would go down, which means that we will view, when we're deciding how to allocate that funding, it'll be viewed more favourably if people can show that what they're investing is sustainable and that it's a climate solution and that it's helping companies transition across the board. So hopefully, like, I know it's not a huge amount of money, but hopefully that the fact that those pots of money come in and are actively going out and seeking some of these solutions, you know, it is part of the mix from that point of view. We've changed the rules for all of the British Business Bank funding. But at the minute, our challenge, and I'm sure it's the same for others, is getting a handle on what our exposures currently are. So we'll get on to the carbon accounting, hopefully, if we've got time. That is really, really tricky to do, you know, and I understand the challenges around that. You know, using a SIC code to try and tell you what sector people are in is really not particularly helpful. And of course, for smaller businesses, it's not necessarily their own business, it's the fact that they're in the supply chain for another business. So what we are expecting to come out as a result of the green finance strategy is a number of what we call sort of blended finance products, where our job is to just take a little share of the risk. So that Barclays example, I should say, is the kind of thing that we would have underwritten with a guarantee, and where I would say, right, well, if you can show that what you're doing is funding something that wouldn't have got funded otherwise, and that as a result of, for example, that Barclays product, because obviously you guys, if it's a sustainability linked loan, you will be tracking whether it achieves where you want it to achieve, and you'll be able to show after a period of time what difference that portfolio has made. It's exactly the kind of thing that we want to back and want to do. So in a blended finance situation where the risk adjusted return maybe doesn't quite work for the finance company because the technology is a bit unproven, or the residual value isn't clear, or the policy isn't really certain enough and they don't really know if they're going too early, too late. What the British Business Bank will do is work with the delivery partner and take a slice of that risk. If anybody's familiar with the recovery loan scheme that we do, or the enable guarantee, that kind of thing, but specifically focused on green stuff. So just from our perspective, I think you can expect to see some degree of support. I don't think the government has the pockets for massive grants and handouts, so there are a few in place, but definitely more blended finance to try and make it more attractive, or things like supporting longer payback periods, because sometimes some of these investments in tech, it's not that they don't make sense in business terms, it's just that they won't pay back for a longer period of time maybe than your lender wants to do, or it's just too much of a capital upfront at this point in time. So also looking at different models for heat as a service, energy as a service, boiler changing, etc., etc. Did that sort of answer it? Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Cool. Okay, so look, various drivers for doing this, and none of these are moral, right? So not teaching anything else. The regulations that are in place are currently obviously biting some of the larger companies first, the idea that it cascades down. I think cascade is a bit of a euphemism there. I'm very worried that it'll actually not just cascade, but they'll be turning around and coming down quite quickly. So we are basically a limited partner that invests into general partners, crudely. So Clarendon would be the general partner and we would be the limited partner. So we're investing alongside lots of other institutional investors. They are already requiring this across the board. And so again, if Marks and Spencer says that they're going to switch, then all of their suppliers will switch. If the limited partners and the institutional finance are forced to do this or want to do this, it'll come down. So you'll find that it affects your ability to fundraise over time where you are on ESG and where you are managing climate risk. The more urgent one, I think the bigger one for smaller companies, is procurement. Again, and some of those branded companies in particular are very conscious of consumer trends and attitudes. All the Tesco trucks that I see driving around London, which is where I am at the moment, all say we'll be net zero by this date, these will all be electric by this date. So there is definitely something around consumer trends, etc. But I think for smaller businesses who don't spend their lives looking at regulation or thinking 20 years out, what will hit them will be being in a supply chain. And I don't know if anybody saw, for example, the US government, Biden has said the US government is the biggest procurer globally. And they've said, we will not be buying anything from you unless you can tell us what your emissions are and you can show us you're on the net zero path. So these are some of the top down stuff that will come. Consumer trends, depends what industry you're in, how much of a driver that is. It definitely vary, things like plastic and recycling and ethical and where your clothes are made. There's lots of ESG coming in there. Employees want to work for these kind of businesses. And then, energy and fuel costs, clearly the most obvious and the most urgent, but a bigger issue depending which sector you're in. So that massive increase in energy costs, and I think some of that is really only just biting now. There are still people who are coming out of quite long-term fixed contracts who only now are confronting this, and let's hope they go back down. I could count on the fingers of one hand things which got more expensive and then get less expensive, but let's hope the energy prices come down. So from a pure cost management point of view, and I guess as an area of investment for me, when I'm sitting on an investment committee and people are talking about why they're raising money, if a business wants to raise, £25,000 to run an ad campaign on TV because it's amazingly going to increase their sales, I have a skeptical reaction to that. And I think the connection between the money going out the door on the advert and the sales coming in is tenuous, hard to prove, may or may not happen, and there's a time delay. if they want 25 grand to go and put in some lagging or insulation or switch to a more energy efficient piece of kit, almost immediately their costs are going to come down from that point of view, and it's more trackable and doable. So there are two different ways of trying to, you know, make the business more profitable, but they've got different risk profiles. So I think there's going to be a lot of focus on energy efficiency, because nobody argues against energy efficiency. Not even the Truss government was anti that. So I think we'll find that that is just a no-brainer, good business thing. And for those who maybe aren't particularly worried about climate change or thinking that far ahead, energy efficiency will do it. And as for the incentives, we talked a little bit about those, but, you know, we've already got this, there's grant funding in place. You know, we're going to be doing, you know, green guarantees. Those are all being designed and worked on. We don't know when exactly they'll come out, but we're definitely open to pitches from people to say, how do we play a role in absorbing a little bit of that risk or in valuing that impact to encourage people to do it? As we've already said, it's a criteria in the selection of the allocation of funds in the Northern Ireland, 70 million, and there's going to be more and more of these coming through from that point of view. So you can decide whether or not this matters, when it matters, how much it matters. Definitely not dictating that. These are just some of the drivers which we think will be coming through over the next couple of years. I'll scoot through these and we'll run out of time, but we'll absolutely say the sides, you know, in terms of those small businesses, where they are on their trajectory. You know, I think in a lot of places, you know, the sort of the motivation is there. They would quite commonly say there's no money to do this, but I think in a lot of cases, some of the reservations are, does the tech exist yet? How do I do this? You know, is there going to be a grant? Is there any support? What's the right way to do it, et cetera, which is kind of what we're coming on to now. This is just an interesting stat. 27% of SMEs are responsible for 98% of our emissions. So it is genuinely just not the same level of issue, depending what sector you're in. But, you know, we pull out agriculture as being one of the ones that with the biggest threat because of emissions, not just through CO2, but obviously through methane with animals, through nitrous oxide, but potentially one of the biggest opportunities because the new revenue streams for nature-based solutions, revenue streams where industries have committed to net zero, can't quite manage it yet, and therefore are going out and investing in their own nature, whether it's trees, peat, soil, whatever the solution is. They can see what the forecasts are for the costs of what's called offsetting, but removals. And I think there's a massive opportunity for Northern Ireland there. That would be one of the really logical areas to push hard on, I would have thought, because this is what makes the economics work potentially from an agricultural point of view. Just quickly, we think there are three ways this affects small businesses. Yes, a lot of this is about them adopting it and how do we do that, but you will have clients who are the innovators, who are the ones who are going to come up with the innovation, the solution, who are in the supply chain for the hydrogen industry, that are there coming up with all the tech and getting it going. Very exciting time for them, lots of money. The Small Business Tracker is coming out, I think, in a week's time, and if you keep an eye out for that. Clean tech bucked the trend for equity. Equity is dropping quite dramatically, and the only sector that isn't is clean tech. So really exciting area to be investing. But a lot of your clients will be enablers for this, and that's one of the areas we're very, very focused on. I really want to make sure we're investing in the enablers before we start pushing too hard on the adopters, because, you know, we need to have the infrastructure in place, the tech in place, the data in place before people can really get moving on this. But these are a suggestion of some of the priority areas. I'm super conscious on time, so I'm going to rattle through. Poll question number 2, just to give you all a break. So this is additional funding, new money, just in the UK, per annum, new money in the UK per annum that we need as of next year. Yeah, absolutely right. Good. So the government doesn't have 50, 60 billion. So this is about crowding in the private sector money and trying to use what we've got as cleverly as possible to try and crowd in what's there. That is a lot of extra money. that we haven't had before. But you know, so yes, climate risk threat accounting, but wow, there's going to be some amazing businesses that get funding, and let's hope an absolute slew of them are in Ulster. Let's just have a quick session on carbon accounting. How much longer have we got?
We have another 15 minutes or so, yeah.
Okay, good. All right. So, well, I'll try and get through bits and pieces. Okay, so this is the main piece of regulation from our point of view. It's what I talked about earlier, the task force for climate-related financial disclosures. And we're expecting this to be extended ultimately to all of the companies in the UK. So initially, all the PRA, all the FCA regulated financial institutions, and ultimately every single company from that point of view. And it's a risk-based approach. And I've done, as I said, 6 startups from nothing. It's really not as hard as it looks, but of course it looks very hard. There's always a nice professional services opportunity when things look very hard but aren't very hard. And so we're really obsessed with the role of the accountants in helping doing that. What's really key is that TCFD guidelines are that this goes in your annual report and accounts. And so we're anticipating as a merging of your financial and non-financial information, your financial accounting and your carbon accounting. And I hope that for some people that sounds like an opportunity as much as a nightmare. So it basically just means that you need to be able to say, we understand climate risk. This is how it affects us, and where it doesn't affect us, this is what we're doing about it. It's all there. And the point of putting it in your ARA is it's in the public domain, it's regulated, and it's audible. Now, you have to manage, though, that if you are a Tesco, and you have to do this already, and it's in your annual report and accounts, they can't put something in with some made up numbers about financed emissions, etc., and who, you know, what their overall supply chain looks like. So what we anticipate is this pressure coming down in terms of those individual SMEs being able to work out their own emissions and report them. Here's another reason why they should do it. And Barclays and others on the call will forgive me, but the banks do have access to spend data. And there are a lot of tools in the market. I'm sorry that I don't know Barclays, but I know the Carbon Planner for RBS and NatWest, developed by Lindsay Cunningham, fellow Ulster woman. And we also know about the various accounting packages which are out there. There is a way that you can do a decent approximation of what your emissions are based on your spending, just by looking at your energy bills and your fuel bills, etc. So if you are the bank for an SME, you've got access to that data and you can form a view of where people are in their carbon. And that's actually, I can see it's great they've invested in those tools. The usability is really good. It is free of charge to the customers that use it, but also it gives the bank, another way of engaging with and talking to their clients and identifying possible products they might want to have and investments they might want to make from that point of view. The other people who have data are the accountants. And there are tools like Sage Earth and Ecology Zero and others. What they're doing is they're just basically going into the chart of accounts and they are automating it, and they're just literally going by your account code and making some approximations, coming back and saying, right, well, we think your carbon footprint is this based on that. And with a click of a button, those kind of, bookkeeping packages will tell you what your carbon footprint is. So again, there's a lot of tech and platforms out there, but that could potentially be an opportunity to be having that conversation with your clients and saying, this is where you need to go. And I would imagine that those of you who have smaller clients, you play many hats. You're doing accounts, you're doing their fundraising, you're managing their tax, you're getting their loans, whatever else it is. So it's really good to have an understanding of this rapidly changing landscape to sort of maximize that value through to the client. So the quick, hopefully you know all of this, but scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So scope 1 is literally your own vehicles and your own buildings that you control and that you use. How do you get your heat from that point of view? What are the various bills that are coming in and how are they all sourced? Scope 2 is your purchased, what you buy in from others from that perspective. And doing scope 1 and scope 2, these are your sort of direct and indirect emissions. That is not particularly difficult, nor does it take particularly long, especially if you do it just on the basis of what you spend. And there are any number of tools out there to tell you what your emissions factors are and how you do it. Problem is there are too many tools out there, and knowing which ones are the good ones and the bad ones is half of the issue. Scope 3 is much, much more difficult. Smaller companies won't have to do it for some time unless they're in a carbon intensive sector. So steel, manufacturing, cement, transport, energy, those are the ones who have to do it first. But if you have a business that is in a supply chain for any of those carbon intensive industries, the big guys have got to report on their supply chain. So that is what I'm saying is going to be a big driver. So if you're a construction firm or a car firm or anything else, you need to get this information from all of your SMEs. And ideally, we want the SMEs to work it out for themselves rather than the data being scraped. Because it's the analogy we use is getting on the scales and going for a run. It isn't all about reporting. The only reason why you're doing the reporting is to show your progress. If I get on the scales again tomorrow morning, I will still be 65.4 kilos because I didn't go for a run. I'd be better off just going for a run every day for a week and then getting back on the scale. So yes, we want to report it, but the purpose of measuring your emissions is to come up with a plan with reducing your emissions, because either you're going to have to, for regulatory reasons, you're going to have to stay in the supply chain, your customers are going to ask it for you, or ultimately you're going to pay a carbon tax, which is currently €80 and forecast to go to €200 per tonne, according to multiple sources. Dear knows what will actually happen. I have no crystal ball. So big companies are committing to all of these targets. We're going to run out of time. There's loads of really interesting partnership for carbon accounting, fantastic tools, standards, etc. to do. If you are really interested in this, which you may not be, massively encourage everyone to get into it. It's a lovely development area. It's very much the zeitgeist. It's in massive growth. There really aren't many accountants out there who can do carbon accounting. Your market rate will go through the roof. But the key thing is a lot of these, I mean, Sweep, have I got the Sweep example? Sweep raised 100 million, you know, about a month or so ago for the next phase of their development of their carbon accounting platform. We talked about Sage Earth, we talked about ecology with a partnership with Zero, Greenly. There are huge numbers out there. And one of the things that the bank is going to do is do a full market survey in Q3 of all of the solutions which are there, what they cost, how long it takes, how hard they are to use, which we're more than happy to come back and share to you guys if that's useful, so that if you were looking at finding something for clients, you would know what was in place. Yes, and that's the final thought, is that, you know, there's various stages from that point of view, but I think the sooner you can get your heads around this, the more value you're adding your clients, you're managing risk better, there's going to be opportunities, there's going to be pots of money available, and it'd be great to kind of stay on top of that. I'll stop there, I think. Cool.
Okay. Thanks again for that, Julia. So there's another question in the box here. Look, we're probably going to be wrapping up soon here, probably the next 5-10 minutes. If anyone else out there has any other questions, if you want to put them in the Q&A box, and we can get those answered. One here from Glenn Nesbitt, who says, I work at the largest solar PV installers in Northern Ireland. And when discussing small and large scale solar projects with commercial customers, the most common question is surrounding how to acquire the funding. Is this something the BBB assist with, or are there any other options that we could steer potential customers to? So
the model for the bank is that we are wholesale. So we are the ones behind the Danskes, the Barclays, the Clarendons, the White Rocks, whatever else from that point of view. So what we are seeing more of and want to see more of is finance providers in Northern Ireland coming to us saying, we are going to fund solar, heat pumps, energy efficiency, EV switching, whatever. And if they come to us with, that's what we call additionality, then we will be looking at ways that we can either, you know, guarantee some of that for them, or co-invest alongside it, or slightly milk the terms, because we've got taxpayers' money. We're not here to make fully commercial businesses more profitable. We're trying to be the Heineken of finance and reach the parts others don't reach. So it would be somebody in, like, let's just take White Rock saying, this is great, we want to fund all of this. And then we would be the third people in the marriage who would say, right, how do we take some of that risk and put some money behind it? But certainly if anybody was pitching for the money in the Northern Ireland Fund, they'd be more likely to get the money if they were funding solar or electric vehicles than if they were funding traditional kit run by fossil fuels.
Yeah, I mean, just to make that clear, Glenn, and speaking on behalf of a funder and other funders in the region, I mean, the banks and alternative funders are open to this funding option. You know, so if you have customers who are want to inject capital into their business to improve it from a sustainability perspective, you know, that is something you can take to a funder. You know, whether that's a bank, whether that's a White Rock, you know, it's certainly there are direct funding options. What funders are looking for is, the business, the repayment ability of that business. And if that piece of kit is going to go in, and obviously there's going to be a cost to it, but it's also going to reduce the energy cost of the business, then that's obviously going to have a positive impact on the P&L. So that should help in terms of the funder getting comfort on repayment. So sometimes maybe I think we get a wee bit carried away where a customer in that scenario is looking for a specific funder who does green. I think you'll find the funders will look at it because it's improving the business. So I don't think you need to find an exclusive funder. You just kind of need to push it out to the potential funders who are out there, be that banks, alternative funders, or whatever. Anyone else with any other questions? Just going to maybe, if there's nothing else, pick up on one here, Julia, just around, what the potential economic benefits for businesses. So yes, there is a compliance piece here, and regulations driving me as an SME to have to actually do this. So I'm kind of forced into it. So I'm going to do it because it's a regulatory requirement. But are there economic benefits for SMEs to be actually looking at in terms of, if they can go on this journey to get to net zero, how is that actually going to impact on their own business and on, say, the valuation of that business?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think definitely focusing on assets first and future-proofing your assets from that point of view. So I would imagine that, as you say, not even in a net zero conversation, looking at, investing in that property to reduce the cost of the bills, to really boring things like lagging and to put the insulation in, etc. Anything that obviously just cuts your energy requirement is a fairly straightforward business case from that point of view. Equally, some of these, in our triangle, you remember, with the enabling and the adopting and the innovators. I mean, I think some of those innovation areas are really exciting. So being in the supply chains for, EVs and hydrogen and green steel and etc. is super exciting. And those businesses are going to go into like super growth because there are so many policies coming out and pots of money that the government is creating around, hydrogen is a particular one, carbon, nature-based solutions, carbon capture, sequestration. There's just going to be a huge amounts of money there. And as I said, the rest of the equity market is dropping and the clean tech is going up to 50%. The other drivers then are just about being first mover advantages. And we know there are first mover advantages and first mover disadvantages, but we just expect that there's to be a fairly rapid change in consumption. And that's B2B and B2C. As there is more transparency and it becomes really obvious whether you are or aren't working in a climate friendly way, and as the incentives come in place and the taxes change, etc., we'll see a gradual transition. So if we all knew when was exactly the right time to invest in the right kit, we probably wouldn't be on this call. We'd be in a beach somewhere, Paul. But the picture I'm trying to paint is, despite changes in individuals or changes in government and Ukraine's, etc., it might be 2 steps forwards, 1 step back, but this is where it's going. And what we're anticipating is that 2030 is going to be a serious wall, and we'll get to 27, 28. If we're not on track, everything is going to step up massively. So I think at a bare minimum, yes, there's going to be an expectation around reporting. the businesses that we see who are at the forefront of adopting these things tend to be entrepreneurs who are future-proofing the businesses anyway, who are adopting, and so many of these things come down to efficiency, you know, that in doing it, you know, and when you switch to the electric vehicles, and one of the key questions I'd love to debate, if anybody wants to talk about it more, is the charging infrastructure in Ulster. You know, people, if you ask them why I haven't bought an electric car, they'll say they've got range anxiety. And so they've got range anxiety because there isn't. I mean, I was over and driving my mother's wee Peugeot, and you know, I just assumed there'd be a charging point every sort of 5 minutes, which there wasn't, and had to go and sweet talk Tesla to let me plug in their garage. But people don't necessarily want to invest in charging infrastructure until more people have cars, and we're getting that chicken and egg. So that's an example of where, you know, as Barclays described, the sort of sustainability linked loans can work, where somebody wants to put in the charging and we say, okay, I'll guarantee you X number of hours of utilization for that charger for the period of time until there are enough drivers to make it worthwhile. And those are the kind of things that I think we can do. But I would love to see agriculture going regenerative, massive investment in niche-based solutions in Ireland, definitely looking at the charging infrastructure, thinking about the heat pump and whether there's ways that we could scale up people from that point of view. I couldn't believe it when I saw the mains gas going in. Literally, I'm done a day. Why are we putting mains gas in for 9 years? Anyway, because the economics of switching from oil to heat pumps is way better than it's hard to argue gas to heat pump on a pure cost basis. It's much easier to argue it from oil. So that didn't necessarily answer your question, Paul.
Yeah, well, I'll give you a little bit of comfort just on your charging infrastructure. There's a customer, some of you are an SME, some of you may have heard of. It was only started up a couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half, called Weave.
Right.
We were an early funder in the business, but they have just had a £50 million capital injection from Octopus, which was announced there last week. So for
brilliant
out of EV charging right across NI. So there are success stories in the background in that. I think maybe just the last thing for me, just in terms of the value proposition for SMEs. You know, we have been speaking to some private equity fund managers recently, and they are now pricing this in to value considerations of businesses. So, you know, on the way in and on the way through. So what they're basically saying is we're going to get alongside a business, going to go on a 3 to 5 year journey before exit. We have to improve the sustainability of that business, because if we don't, the next person buying the business will be discounted if we haven't. So if you're an M&A advisor or whatever, think that this is going to become real as we go into the future, that your clients, you know, they've got to make these changes. Otherwise, the entrepreneur is going to get less for the business when they go to sell it. So that will be the reality of it. People will be coming along and marking, you know, based on how compliant and how sustainable you are. So it has a live business value impact as businesses go forward. Okay, well, look, Julia, thank you very much for that. I'm sure we are stopping you. Could go on for hours on your favorite topic there, but thanks everyone. I think we have had about 70 odd participants. I think we've only had 2 drop-offs in 15 minutes.
And listen, there's more in the slide deck there, and there's a slide at the back with just some more links to where you can go to for more information. And you know, Susan and I are always interested in opportunities to come and sit and chat and go through bits and pieces. Watch this space, because I think the main thing is, Susan, we need to keep you guys totally up to speed as and when these green products come out, as the incentives are in place. Maybe we need to come back and give you another hit and keep people up to date. So thank you very much, Paul and Karen and Gary, for having us. And you know where to find us if you need any more.
No problem. Well, thank you for that, Julia. And just to say, the slide deck will be sent out to everyone who's on the call today tomorrow, as I understand. So you can peruse through at your leisure the detail that's in the pack. So listen, once again, Julia, thank you very much. And we're now keeping everyone from their lunch. So maybe they're having their lunch while they're watching. So
probably.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks, man. Cheers all.